5. So this session is entitled Building a Structured App with XPages Scaffolding, which is sort of a misnomer, as I'll go into soon, but it's still true. Like, this is still a valid thing, but there is more and different parts to it, as I will get into. So, a little personal introduction. For those who don't know me, my name is Jesse Gallagher. I am the CTO of MWLUG guys. And really, there are 3 of us, so CTO is 3, but we are a Domino consulting contracting company. We do other stuff. We have some WordPress sites and other products, but we're primarily Domino because we've been doing it for a very long time. So I know some guys who go on our website, shows also projects, and you're very welcome to contact us for any Domino consulting, mentoring, just want me to work on an app, want the other guys to work on an app, all of us, we're happy to do it for money. Smaller questions I'm happy to answer for free, but there's a level. I blog frequently at XPages.us, which is a Simpsons reference. It's not just random crap, it's actually Simpsons reference, but that's my personal blog. And I generally blog about basically the kind of thing I'm going to talk about today, which is XPages development, Java. Sometimes I'll blog about other stuff, not usually personal stuff, but just other technology-related things. And primarily, it's going to be XPages-related stuff. And other things I'm interested in, Couchbase, Swift, things like that. So you can email me at jesse@iknowsomeguys.com. I am on Twitter at Kidgerby, which is World of Warcraft thing, but that is, so it doesn't really mean much either Twitter and Facebook and Kidgerby. I love hearing from people, any questions that you have about this or other Java stuff. Worst case, I'll say I don't know, but I always love hearing from people and getting emails and questions. If you're trying my stuff or you're using somebody else's stuff and you want to know about it, feel free to contact me. So I want to begin. There's two main sections of this presentation. The first one is what I'm going to call a meditation on app structure. More accurately, it's going to be me ranting about XPages and how everybody, including me, is doing it wrong. And then the second is going to be a demonstration of how you build an app using my code, which was historically called the XPages Scaffolding project, and that still exists. But then it's kind of morphed into this Frostilicus framework. Frostilicus framework is the larger version of XPages Scaffolding. So, app structure in XPages is problematic. These are XPages applications. Like this is the state of XPages development. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying all of your apps are train wrecks. I'm saying that as a culture, including me, this is kind of what we have. We make great apps, we do great things, but the components and the structure of an app are a mess. And the weird thing is, I realized the other day that this was actually better in old versions of Notes. Because in old versions of Notes, you had outlines. That was an outline. You had your views that meant this is a view that shows the data. You have a form that's editing a document. You had, everything was clearly delineated. You go into XPages, you have XPages and custom controls. And an XPage could be editing a document. It could be looking at many documents. It could be whatever. And this is generally good. Like, the old forms views, that's something. But what you end up with is that if you come into an app, you have no idea what that app is really doing. Like, say somebody just says, hey, I made a task tracking app, and here it is. But you have no idea, all right, how are the items stored? What are the important fields? What are the relationships between the different things? There's no way to know, because you look at it, okay, so on this X page, you have some formulas, act functions and server JavaScript that sets some fields and just does replace item value here. And it's like, okay, that looks like that's where you create items, but is that the only place? Like, what happens over here? Is that doing all of the business logic? Like, so are you allowed to have a summary that's more than 50 characters? Okay, so here it says at trim, or not at trim, at left the 50. Okay, so that must be a business rule, I guess, but it's not really enforced anywhere. So there's no central place. Like, you can't look at an app and say, what's important? And then it gets further on. Like, does this deal with any other databases? How many distinct forms of business objects are there? What does this even use Domino data as the backend store? Like, there's no clear place where you say, I just want to know about the model objects, like the core stuff. There's no structure for it. And that part has been the same forever too. And this is something where if you look at other development environments, they generally have ways to do this. Not everyone. You've got PHP, where it's also a mess. This is also PHP. But then you have other ones where you have your models. You have your clear, like, this is where the data connection is defined. This is where the model object is defined. This is what it looks like. And so you can come in, and people who know me will know I can't go 20 minutes without bringing up Rails, even though I don't program in Rails. You look at a Rails app and you can see, here are the models. Here's what they all are. They all look the same, and you can just say, all right, I know what this app has. You don't know everything, you don't know every single little bit of code, but you can just look at it and say, that's, there's an item, there's a project, there's a client, this is how they relate, this is exactly, and it's just defined. Like, this relates to this has many of these, and it's, I got it. I know. You can come in from the outside, completely clean, and unless the original programmer was just completely insane, you could tell what that app is doing. You can't do that with XPages. There's, other than if they're based on the same template, there are no two XPages applications that look at all alike. You can't come into somebody else's, you can't come into your own app from, a year ago that you forgot about. It's all completely different. My apps have been, every couple of months, my apps look completely different. And so, you have this problem where it's like, an XPages app is basically just a bunch of code in a bucket. You have a bucket of code, and it's like, all right, there's some model stuff in there. There's like, all right, so some of it's UI, some of that does validation, and how do you do how does it connect to other stuff? Does it provide any REST services? Does it consume any REST services? I don't know. Maybe just I can search the code for XE REST service or whatever. It's like that. Once you get to the point where you're trying to use tooling to try to figure out what is even in this app at all, that's a problem. And so, what I've been doing myself and then through the kind of code I'm going to demonstrate is just say, okay, that is awful. But there's no clear thing in XPages to do it right. There's no right way to find in Designer. Designer's not helpful. If you want to say, I want to have, I want my model objects are, item and client and project. You can make a form, but that doesn't help really define much. You can put some, that's a little, that's something. But you don't even need that. I don't make forms anymore. And so I've been trying to come up with better ways myself, just generally to say, I want to make my apps look the same. I want to say, when I want to do a model, I do it this way. When I want to have a bunch of code, I do it this way. When I want to have a beam, I do it this way. And that's the way, so that 6 months, a year from now, I can come back and say, okay, I need to refamiliarize myself with this. I can just look at it and know, I get not 100% of everything, but I get it. I understand what this app is like. And so that's one of my main goals with just my own programming and generally, it's to have some consistency and they're both side effects, consistency and also just better programming. Because once you know this is how you do a model object, you don't even have to think about it. So if I go into a project and I say, okay, now I want to add, an email contact record or something. I don't, if I know the way I do that is I go create a model object, I inherit from this class and say it's email contact record. And it's all done the same way, and I can say, I add the fields that need validation and add it in. It looks exactly like all the other ones. So I don't have to figure, I don't have to think of a new way to do it this time and just do the same thing all the time. Because at that level, the core structure should look the same. The front end should look different. The front end should look like, whatever makes sense for the app you're doing. You don't want all of your apps to be one UI, but you want the core to be consistent and predictable, and then you get features, and I have some nice fun bonus features that you get from using my stuff, but you get it with your own as well. And so it's easier for you as a programmer to learn it, to do it in the first place. Fewer decisions. You don't have to make these decisions about all right, how do I want to do my XPage? How do I want to do the way I get to the data? It's just do the same thing every time because it works, and then that's how you do it, and that's how ideally your colleagues do it. And then once everybody in the world is using my framework, that's how all the other XPages applications, that's how they do it. So everybody's all the same, it's not bad, but it's good in this sense. So that gets to what the ostensible thrust of my presentation is, which is the XPages Scaffolding and Frostillicus framework. So they began originally as a collection of the various bits and bobs I use. Basically anyone who does nodes development eventually says, I'm just going to put this in an NTF and just have script libraries and have all that. And this is how this started too, the XPages version. So it started out all right, I always use these custom controls. I always use these, this CSJS to patch some Dojo stuff. I always use, and then I started doing like, okay, well I have controller classes, which is one of the main components of the framework. And then I have, model objects, and I always do this, and so it's like, okay, now it's my template, which is called XPages Scaffolding, because the idea is, rather than doing, new app, blank app, and then having to, from scratch, do everything, this is, this is the NTF I have on my server. I just want to start an XPages app, so I can start out with, layout custom control and a bunch of handy custom controls for doing some like date doc conversion, that kind of thing, and a bunch of Java. And I can use that, and if you guys download the XPages Scaffolding, you can use any or all of it or none of it. But it's basically like a starting point for like, I want to make an app, not just I want to make an NSF with nothing. So it started out as that. Like this is the first step of all of my XPages applications. Over time, it's grown into basically the Cross-Syllabus framework. I haven't ended up changing that name. It's just, that's my blog, that's my framework. But it's grown into, all right, it's not just these are useful little tools, this is the structure of what all of my applications should look like. At least when I have the discretion to do that. Client apps, they don't have to, but other ones, this is what I want all of my applications to look like. And so I've got controller objects, there's models, I have some hooks for making simplified servlets, which are like XAgents. To a certain extent, servlets in XPages versus XAgents. XAgents have some technical advantages, servlets do a little as well, but it's like I do a lot of servlets, and the way to get to do like raw Java servlets in XPages is kind of wonky. So I have some stuff that's like, oh, now it's easy, I just do servlet dot whatever, and now I have a servlet with that name, and it works right. And I have, this is all built on the OpenNTF Domino API, which once I was able to move over to that, was one of the best feelings, because I had so much code in my model framework for doing like MindBeat stuff and fixing up data types, or like I don't want vectors, I'm gonna argue whatever, like all this other stuff. And then it's like, oh, now I'm just gonna say it's on the OpenNTF API. Delete, 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 all gone. I deleted so much code. Now it's better. And I use the OpenNTF API as much as possible. Oh, actually, I should.
Perhaps turn on the mic.
Yeah, I did. I've been talking this whole time without the mic. Is that better?
It's better.
Oh, yeah.
My apologies. Now I don't need to yell as much. So, given that I'm one of the main programmers on the OpenNTF API, I probably should be using it, so it's not, I am a little biased in that I wrote much of the code, but it's something where like once you have it and you just assume it's there, there's so much you just don't have to do anymore. Recycling, that is the start of it. But then dealing with data objects, you can just throw whatever you want into a replace item value or put into a document, and there's just so much that you just don't have to worry about anymore. And I deleted so much code in my framework. I deleted so much code in all of my other apps. Whenever I move them over, it's like you switch it over. It's like, oh, I can just get rid of so much. I don't need to worry anymore. Plus all of the other extra features, the graph stuff, which I actually haven't gotten into yet, and all the other. I mean, it's not an ad. Well, this session is not an ad for the OpenNTF API, but this part is. But there's just, there's so many things in there. If you haven't checked it out, I recommend you do. And not just because I wrote much of it. So, other stuff in there, like I say, it has a bunch of utilities. That's how it began. I've got my own version of a JSF util that's got handy. It's got what's called framework utils now, but it has handy things that like aren't in the XLive util. It's just little things that you use all the time. So like, I want to post a message, and it's a little easier that way. And I want to get the view root, and they don't have to do the same resolve variable. And it is like all the little things that you just build up. That's still in there. And the useful custom controls. So when I start, I have, I don't have to do another, display date time control if I want to be consistent. I don't have to do another layout because I just have it there. I'll end up tweaking it, and but I have the start. I have like, this is my layout control. I have my links bar control, and these are the places where I can start, and I don't have to redo the same thing every time. That's the core scaffolding aspect is still very much in there. What it is not a UI framework. The way I do my user interfaces lately is I tend to use stock controls. I use the application layout, I use widget container, I use form table, and I tend to use render kits to do this, which are difficult to write, so it is not necessarily what everybody should do immediately. There is an upcoming Notes at 9 that I did about starting with render kits, whenever Dave gets around to posting it. An upcoming one I did like a month or two ago. But no, So I like to use my personal preference, which I'll demonstrate, is using standard controls rather than, because I know it's best to do Bootstrap, which is generally better than One UI, not for absolutely everything, but it's that's the way to go. You want to do Bootstrap stuff, or Foundation UI if you're Chris Toohey, but you want to do Bootstrap stuff, and so normally the way you do that is you end up doing a whole bunch of like div class equals call, div class equals row, and you just have all this Bootstrap stuff in your XPage. I don't want that. As much as possible, I don't want my XPage to contain any Bootstrap stuff, but I want it to be all Bootstrap. So the canonical example of this is the Bootstrap for XPages project, from which I've stolen a tremendous amount of code for my own renders. But like what that does is you use standard controls. You use application layout, you use widget container, you use dialog, and it converts it over to Bootstrap without you having to write every single little thing. You don't have to write tons of jQuery to get everything right. It does that for you, and that's my preference. And which is a roundabout way of saying there's no UI stuff in my code. There's like the layout, there's the basics, but you're free to delete all that stuff. So this is not about all of your apps visually look identical. The client experience shouldn't be different for every app to a large extent. And if it's not, just use the same render kit and use the same controls. It's also not an all or nothing proposition. And I'm going to be going over a number of things, and there are some, all of them are basically interchangeable. You can use just controllers, you can use just model objects, you can keep writing in server JavaScript if you want to do this, but you shouldn't. You can. You don't have to go whole hog. This is not it's not a framework where it's instead of writing XPages apps, I will write framework apps. No, it's like these are tools that work with XPages. As much as possible, my goal is when the stuff that ships with XPages makes sense, use that. When it doesn't, replace it, but not in a way that's incompatible. Like you can use Domino document data sources, you can use whatever normal things that you want to use. It all works with it. And this is not the only way to do it. So this is my current version of how I do structured apps in XPages. There are some other things. The XPages toolkit has some similar. There's some overlap there, and there's some great stuff there. That's a very valid way to do it as well. There's I assume there's other toolkits out there and frameworks, and those are all good too. You can do your own. Like you don't have. I'm not saying this is the only way to do it. I'm saying this is. I really like it. It saved me a lot of hassle, and I've done some pretty cool things with it. So this is an example. Some of them, you could just take the controllers, for example, that's probably the easiest one to just take and use on your own. This is not, I'm not up here to say if you're not using my framework, you're doing it wrong. I am up here to say if you're not writing structured applications, you are doing it wrong, because we all are doing it wrong, that is. But you don't have to use this. I would like you to, and you are welcome to. It is open source and free. But if you don't, since I'm not charging for it, I'm not losing any money. So the structure of it. There are a number of main components of what these apps look like. They're controller classes. If you're not familiar with what controller classes are, technically speaking, in a larger world context, it's a little iffy of a name. But what it refers to is a class that goes alongside an individual XPage and contains the executable code. So like all the stuff that you would do normally in server JavaScript, instead you do it in Java, but you do it in this controller class that's tied to it. So you say you have your home page, you have a home controller. You have your list your items page, you have a list your items controller. And so the code, like the executable stuff that you want from here, is in this controller class over here. So it's basically like a separation of executable code from the front end UI, but it's still bound conceptually. And the reason I do this is because if you use server JavaScript, all right, I have to complain about server JavaScript at least once during this session. As a language, it's fine. There are severe issues with it, but it's fine. It's not that bad. It's the way that you write. It's the programming models that server JavaScript leads to that are severely broken and gets you the train wreck you saw earlier. One of the first things I did with XPages, well, not the very first thing, but early on with XPages, one of the things I did was that I added Ruby, programming language Ruby, which is my absolute favorite, to XPages as a replacement for server JavaScript. So anywhere where you'd have, hash bracket JavaScript : you could do hash bracket Ruby : and you could write all same code. I wrote, my blog was in that, I did some other little things here and there with that, and it worked. And then even though I wrote it and I spent a lot of time learning and I figured out a lot of things, I never use it now. The reason is that having your code on an X page like that is the worst thing you can do. Once you do that, once you have like a button that says, here's my button, and what it has is a whole bunch of like doc.replace item value, doc.replace item value, doc.save, and it's just there on the X page. It'll work for the first X page, but then you have the second one, and then you can copy it there. It's like, oh, I could do a custom control, or I could do a server JavaScript library, and I'm sure there are apps that are written in server JavaScript that are pristine, but it's still fighting against the platform. Like everything about Designer wants you to just write a bunch of code in there, like in a form. Like you make a button and you want to write some code, and Designer says just put it here, just put all your code right here because it's so easy, it's so straightforward. And it is easier at first, but you pay for it. You pay for it later. And so that structure, I did it for a while. Most of my early apps were like that, but it is not worth it. Let me tell you. And that's the problem. That's one of the main things that controllers try to solve, which is that it gives you a place for your executable code that's not the X page. You end up with much cleaner X pages. You end up with a better knowledge of what the code is. It helps you when you want to refactor it. It's there, like you know where the code is. Again, this is about looking at an app. I want to find the code. That's where it is. It's in the controller package, and it's in these classes. There are also models. These are the data models I was referring to, item, client, project, whatever. This is a thing, a noun that exists in this database. And so I have classes that wrap around Domino documents. Theoretically, I could do other backends eventually, but they wrap around Domino documents, and they let you do business logic associated with that model. So in a normal application, you'd have a button that it does validation. The validation is done on the fields, and in any computed stuff will be done in the code in the button, even if it's a controller. But it's still like that's not really the model. What you want to do is say, all right, for clients, the name has to be at least 3 characters. Normally, the way you do that is that every time you have an input field that refers to the client name, you say min equals 3 or whatever it is, or the validator for the length. And that works until you forget to do it once, or somebody else comes in and doesn't do it. Or you want to do a REST API and you got to re-implement all that stuff, and you have to redo all of your rules everywhere. With the model framework I use, I have my customer class, and I have the name field, and I just do min equals 3. And then that means the minimum length, no matter how it is, it could be on an X page, it could be REST service, it could be whatever. It's enforced because that's the model object, like that's there, and that's where it's supposed to be. Like the business of the rules of what a client or a customer can and cannot have in the fields that's the job of the model. That's not the job of anything else. And so when you have this, okay, what are my models? They're in the model package. They all have these rules. I want to see, what are the restrictions? What happens when you save? So when you do on the query save code, that's in the model. So what happens when you do that? Like what type of document it is, what the form? It's all there. It's not scattered on every design element. It's not implied by whatever. It's just there. Renders. This is what I talked about earlier with UI stuff. There aren't any renderers in the framework, but that's because I encourage doing it yourself or using Bootstrap for X pages or sticking with one UI. Certainly you can do all the Bootstrap stuff. It is easier. Renderers are not easy. So if you make your apps with hard-coded Bootstrap things, that's fine. That is a perfectly reasonable thing to do just because renderers are they're difficult. But if you know Java and you do learn that, it will pay off. I love using renderers for all this stuff. It saved it, again, deleted so much code and it's so much cleaner. And if somebody else wants to come in and look at my app, they see widget containers and form tables. They don't see 50 layers of div, span, article, whatever. Like they don't see all this nonsense HTML that doesn't mean anything. They see, oh, I have this component and this is its these are its properties. And so using those standard ones makes a lot more sense. But admittedly, renderers are difficult. So yeah, server JavaScript. I do use server JavaScript. I use it in custom controls because there's not really a good way to do controller code in custom controls. Like you can put it out in beans. But my philosophy on custom controls generally is that they should be like controls. Like that they're not for content. They're for your layout. They're for like a specialized input, a specialized display, where you pass it a value and it's that you do something with this. So if in there, like if you want to do something with the pager to have it show differently or whatever, and you have a little server JavaScript, that's fine because it wouldn't make sense to break that out. So server JavaScript, like I said, fine as a language in its place. It's fine. For most of your logic, it should not be there.
Other common package names, yeah, this is, as I'll get to, I don't really need to get into it now, but it's a set of common package names that I use. Again, this is all about, I want to look at, so I want to know what the config, where the config objects are, well, they're in the config package. I want to know where the model objects are, they're in the model package. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to demonstrate a simple application. First, I'll show the end result. So this is using a Bootstrap theme from Rat Bootstrap, Ace Admin. This is what I'm talking about, where I like to use these things. You buy it for 15 bucks. I happen to write a bunch of renderers for it. You don't have to, but I like using. You can get a Bootstrap theme, and it could look completely different. This is not the most complicated app. Normally, you wouldn't just have a home page with this demo app on it, but in this case, it does. But this is using the same bicycle information database that was used in a couple other Java sessions, and so it's basically simple. In the back end, it's a notes database. You have these are just a bunch of documents in the same form. You have all items, the catalog, and categories, and manufacturers, and it looks like an XPages app. It doesn't have to look like this. It could look completely different, but for this demo, it looks like an XPages app. It's just done much more cleanly. So looking at the code. So first, I'll go with what an individual page looks like. Oh, jeez. So this is the items all page, so it's just one of the views, effectively. And you can see I have XE layout in there as an application layout, very standard. I do the same kind of, I have action bar, links bar, pretty standard stuff. I use a view panel. I'm hooking it up to my own data source. This is not connected to a Domino view directly, but I'm using a view panel because why not? It does the job here. I want a table of stuff. I want to categorize columns. I want to be able to collapse those. View panel works. It's not the best, but it works. And that's part of the point. Like, when it makes sense to just use the standard controls, use the standard controls. Like, you don't have to redo everything. It doesn't always have to be repeat with all your own custom stuff. And so, looking at this, this is what a normal view panel looks like. You got columns. You got you have your page name. It looks normal, and that's part of the point. In this case, this makes sense. This kind of XSP markup makes sense. I don't want to replace that. I don't want to have custom specialized controls for every single thing. This works. And so, but what you see here, the fancy part is this. So I'm saying I want to get from the MBI items object, which is the collection of all MBI items, I want to get the collection called all items. That ends up referring to a view in this database, all items. So it has these columns, you have those columns. And so the idea of this is like, I'm using a view on the back end, but I don't have to do XP Domino view, because then I'd have to do database name equals, view name equals, whatever. It's like, no, I just want to ask the MBI items collection, the manager, give me whatever all the items are. Most of the time, that's just going to go to a view. Sometimes it could go to a specialized collection. Sometimes you could do extra stuff saying, like, in our task tracking database, I have tasks.mine. And so that says, okay, take the category that's the current user's name and give back that subsection of the view. But you don't have to go here and say category filter equals whatever, you just say task.mine. And so your XPage code is clear. I want to have a collection that's my tasks. And so that's done via model objects. So I have this very simple, this is the simplest sort of thing you can do. I have a model object, which is MBI item. So that's a thing, it generally corresponds one-to-one with a form. So there's a form, I believe it's item. I didn't want to call my class item because you end up regretting it, Dave. And so, admittedly, in non-Domino context, item is fine. Like, it's not a bad class name, but if you're dealing with Domino objects, it gets rough. So I have my MBI item, and just looking at this code, like these use Hibernate validator, but just looking at it, you don't need to know what Hibernate validators are. You can tell, all right, I've got an item number, it has to be not empty. I have an item name, it has to be not empty. Down there, I have an item unit price. The minimum is 0, it can't be negative money. Just looking at it, it's like, oh, that's my item. I don't need to go and see every time I have an input field for the item number, is there a validator that says this is required, or is there a validator on the unit price? That's here. I say, this is my object, these are the rules. Done. And the rest is handled by the framework. And so you can see here, this is the equivalent of like a compute with form. There's a couple methods, and it does get into stuff where you kind of just need to know what the objects are and the structure of it, but basically saying here, when you create a new one in it from database, set the item value to 0. This could also be done on the form. You can always just do compute with form, that works too. But this is effectively the equivalent of default values. So you have your main item basically saying this, or your main model object saying this is the MBI item, and then each one has what's called a manager, and this is what you saw with the MBI items, all items. And this manager is saying this is how it knows that how to get to the documents on the back end. So basically saying this is where you say get the database. So these are stored in different databases. This is not data stored in the same NSF. That's another thing I like to do. I like to store data in a separate NSF just for app structure, even if it's only just one. If it's just app and data, I prefer to do that. It's one of those things that it's not required. NSF works fine if you have app and data in the same one, but you'll be happy that you did it later. With XPages, especially if you're using something like this, it doesn't even matter. It works great. Like that's not a limitation that we have to stick with anymore. So I'm saying you get the database specially. I could delete it and it will be the same database, but this is reaching out. I have a method for get view prefix. What this means is normally if I'm setting up an app, I would name my views like items / whatever, items / all, items / categorize, or whatever you'd have. These views, since I was using a database that I didn't write, don't have a prefix, so I just went with none. And the idea here is that you can use this to connect to existing Domino data. You don't have to do all of your data completely new. You're still using documents. So you can see that the result, like I was saying, but all that is just, I just want to see all items. Show me all items. And you can see, it goes to the other views on the other XPages, similar idea. Show me this view. Oh yeah, it works with dynamic view panels. See, that's another thing. It's like, why not? I like dynamic view panels sometimes. You don't normally want to finish your app with dynamic view panels because they're a little wonky, but for scaffolding to get started, works great. So the views, sure, that's one thing. So you also want to, create and edit items, CRUD operations. So looking at it, you see I'm using a form table from the extension library. So this is the XPage that actually does the editing itself, and this is just using a form table. And because why not? That's conceptually it means this is a form table. It's not div class equals form horizontal or form vertical or whatever. It's a form table. And then I have renderer code that happens to spit it out in a very bootstrap friendly way. But I like having conceptually similar things. Things do get a little weird and fun. This is some stuff I've really enjoyed. I'll get to that after I talk about controllers, which are much simpler than the stuff I'm about to talk about. So controller classes, like I was saying. The way controllers work is that all the code that you would put in server JavaScript, you instead put in a Java class. And the way I do it is very convention-based. So I have an XPage named items_item. So my controller is named, it's in the controller package, and it's named items_item. And then when you're on that controller, when you're on that XPage, it just exists. I have some code in the back end that looks for this class and picks the right one, but as long as you just name it that, it just exists. And that makes it easy because you want to see, all right, I want the controller for home. You look at controller home. It's always called that. It doesn't, these are all these objects are stored just in the NSF, so you don't need to have a long package name. You don't need to do, com.somecompany.xpages.someapp. You can. You don't in my framework, but you can generally. It doesn't hurt, but you don't need to. So it's always just controller.home. That's where the home controller is. So the items controller has a bit of code, and so these controllers are basically they're just objects. They're just Java objects. And so you have, this is what happens when you save. So earlier in a normal server JavaScript-based application, this would be in the button that does save. You'd have similar code. It would be in server JavaScript instead of Java, but same idea. Same with delete and just internal utility things. So what you're saying is, I want to put my code here. And the way you access that is, here we go. The way I access that is using EL. You can say, all right, you have your bog standard button, value save, event handler, and so instead of having action, pound bracket JavaScript and then a bunch of stuff, you just do controller.save. This is, in EL parlance, is a method binding. What it's saying is take the bean that's controller. With this framework, your controller is always just controller, and it's just there. And so find the controller object and do the save method, and it just passes it on. And so your XPage code ends up being 3 lines for the button. It doesn't end up scaling with how much work you need to do. It doesn't matter. If my save method was 7 pages long, it should be refactored. But if it was 7 pages long, your XPage code would still be nice and clean and focused on the user interface. So what you're doing here is you have a button. What you don't care about on the XPage side is how that button saves the document. that is wildly irrelevant to the task of I'm making a user interface. So when you have controllers like this, that means that you can end up with your X page. It's just the structure of the user interface. The X page is the UI. It is not all the code that operates on it. It has to know about it a little because you have to tie it into save, but it is not executable code. It's just the UI. So you say, I have a layout, I have a form table, I have a view panel, I have any of the other controllers, widget containers. You have the point of the X page markup is to have the UI. It is not to do all of your business logic. It is not to do a bunch of data manipulation. It's to say, when the user comes, yes, so when the user is here, they need to say, this is not a good UI, but the idea is still there, which is like the X page is supposed to say, here's how the fields are laid out, here's what the label should be, here's what it should be. It shouldn't be, here's how to get the data from the database, here's how to save it, here's what you do. Because ideally, in a grand world where all Domino development shops had giant teams with multiple groups, you'd want somebody working on, yes, I know it's always just one person, but ideally, but you can act as different people. Like ideally what you'd want is having somebody working on the XPages side and somebody working on the data model side. And the XPages person would work with the designer and they'd work with the data model person, but the designer and the data model don't care about each other. And well, they might personally, but not in the context of application development. But so the X page should just be focused on like, what does the UI look like? Because then, say I had my code in here, then I want to say, all right, well, I don't want to use a button anymore. I want to use a link, or I want to use a fancy drop-down thing. Now I have to bring that code with me and make sure it's like, okay, if I'm using a drop-down, I got to do it over here, make sure I don't delete anything. And so now instead of just changing like one little control, now I'm migrating code from place to place, and if you had 50 lines of code, now you just have all this stuff, and you're scrolling through, and you're just asking for bugs. Like you'll accidentally leave the event handler where it is, and now it's an event handler for a table row instead of a button, and so yeah, it's a mess. It's just, but once you don't have your code there, now you're just saying, I just want to make the UI. If I want to completely revamp this, I can do that, and then code is separate somewhere else. It's just handled, because that's not the point of what the user interface is. The X page is the user interface, and it connects to the back end with the UI via the controller. So the X page is not a place for executable code. Custom controls a little bit, generally no. So this binding thing. This was kind of a fun thing. It was a couple months ago, and this is one of the newest parts. There's this binding property on all components in XPages. It's been there since 8.5. It's a very JSF-y kind of thing, and it had been there, and nobody had any idea what it's used for. What it does is itself not that useful, because what it does is you say, all right, I want to bind this control to some field in an object. And so you'd have a field, like in a controller, if you'd have submit button and the UI component, when the XPage loads, it would set itself to that field. Great, I can always do get component. Like that doesn't do me anything. But what I realized is if I kind of mess with it a little bit, I can do some crazy work and basically say now, what I'm doing is I'm saying this form row refers to the field on this model object. Because I have a model object that knows what the fields are. It knows what the restrictions are. It knows what the label is. And so I don't have to do all that on the XPage. What I know is like I have a form table and a form row, and after that point, the XPage doesn't have to care anymore. Because it just says, all right, controller, do whatever you need to do to show me an appropriate thing for the item number. In this case, it's just an input text. It could be a date time field. It could be a file upload field once I implement that. It could be any sort of thing where it's like at that point, what you're doing is say, I am setting up a user interface for editing data, but the part of editing data is up to whatever that data is, whatever tool I'm using. If you could be different on a mobile browser. It could be one thing on the desktop. It could be if in Xpaint the good stuff doesn't work and you got to go to a crappier one, you can do that, or just don't use Xpaint. There's a lot of don't use in my presentations, I understand. But what I'm saying here, like what's going on is like now there's no label here, there's no field here, and so but what happens is I end up with a field and I end up with validation. So if I delete item number, I need a, like I said, not the best UI, but that's not the problem in the framework. That's my problem. But there's no validator in this code. There's no field in this code at all. It's just saying go to the item number. But it knows item number should be a text field and it should be required. And so it sets up a validator, it sets up a message that connects right to that, because that's how you're supposed to do it, and it goes with this idiom, and it works great. Sometimes there's some things where it's like, okay, for this one I want a text area because the description is going to be longer, and so you can still do the binding, but then you just say, give it a control, and what it does is it searches for the first control and says, all right, I'll adapt to that. So it just adapts to that. But the control, you don't need to do value equals whatever. There are a lot of things that I may or may not do with this. There's a lot, but just the notion, again, this is another area where I've saved so much code in my project, where I just get rid of the same kind of weirdo date time control thing I was doing, and I just say, it's a date time field, and it's just done. And it works better with internationalization. This app generally is not very internationalized, but I put my item, I say, all right, I have model translation.properties, and I just put my translations here. And so item no goes to item number. There's nothing in the Java class that says item number. There's nothing on the XPage that says item number, but instead it's here. So I can go to item numbers. Item numbers. And this works, like I was saying, for translation. This is just English, but it works for translation, where if I had model translation _fr.properties, and a French user comes, and I had, numeral de item, I forget what item is. I used to know French, I don't now. I should have looked that one up, actually. What? Yeah, look. Well, I know it's numero. I don't remember what item is. Litem. But they would get this translated one. So this is a way where it's like, all right, now anytime I'm referring to item number anywhere in my application, and suddenly we want to support Spanish, you just do it in the translation file, and everything now refers to it in Spanish. And this is like a minor thing, because there are ways to do translation in XPages, but this is a nicer way. It's built in, and I realized, like, wait, since I'm building the controls, I can just do this. I can just do it for free, because I'm doing this structured code. And that's the sort of thing. It doesn't always have to be, it's not just the stuff I've done. It gets to one of the reasons why you do structured code. It's like once you start structuring your code, it doesn't have to be the way I've just showed you. It doesn't have to be with my model objects. It doesn't have to be with my controllers. But once you get to the point where you are structuring your code in some way, it could be like mine, that'd be great. But in some way, once you do that, you start noticing things. Like you start noticing, I don't need to do X, Y, and Z anymore. I don't need to do translation the same way I did before. I can do it in this new way. I don't need to do validators the same way. I can do it this new way. I can do these things. And you start, then the more you do structure and the more you do Java, you start finding places where you can use code that already exists. For example, there are the validators that exist in XPages, but they're not very complicated. But what I did is I went to hibernate.org, which Toby just had a great session on, which is, that's a model, an abstraction layer for a SQL database, and they have one for NoSQL, but they have a project called Hibernate Validators. And it's a bunch of Java annotations where you can specify validators. You can go much more complicated. You have regular expressions. They have one where it's just at email address, saying this is an email address, and it's handled. And it's this project where it's like, they've built this. They have already built these validators. I don't need to go in and rewrite the same XP custom validator in every app. I don't need to go and write my own XPages validators at all. Like, they've done it. And I just use theirs and say, if I want to match it against regular expression, I just use it. And at some point, I'm probably going to use some of their other code. I have a couple other things that I want to work in. And you find all these places where it's like, this stuff is solved. These are solved problems. And because my structure is like this, I add all this validation stuff. I added way after I did all the other model stuff. So I'd already done, I was using model objects, but then it's like, oh, I just want to do validation. Just throw it in there, and then I can leave the rest of my code. Like eventually I go and delete the validators, but even if I didn't, new validators would just work. It'll just work. And because it's all separated, it's all structured. And I know if I want to improve my models, I just do that, and then everything wins. Suddenly I have more translations. Suddenly I have more validation options, all this stuff. Like, you get new things from doing structured code. Whereas if you're not using model objects, if you're not using controllers, and you say, I just had the best idea for how I want to redo some core part of my app. Now you have to go to every single XPage, every single script library, every single Java class you have, because code's everywhere, and you just gotta say, no, now it's one place. It's just in one place. And you gain so much from really structuring your code, really thinking about it. A year from now, I'll know what this means. I wouldn't necessarily know what it meant if I just had a bunch of validators everywhere. You learn all that, you find better places, you can make your code better, you can make your own framework, you can use mine, you can ask me about it. You can improve on it. There's probably plenty of places where it can be vastly improved. And it's just like, you think about this, and you shouldn't, the more you think about like as app as a structure, all of your apps should have a structure. It should be consistent, and it should make sense, and then it just improves the way you look at your apps, the way you look at XPages. And then you can start, you know, as you dive more into Java, you start thinking about what can I do with components? What can I do with render kits? Stuff that normally you're so many levels away with doing server JavaScript in a button that that's not on your radar. But then once you've cleaned away the brush, once you have a consistent way, like then you can start thinking, all right, I've solved so many problems, I can do more. I can solve more problems even easier. And well, assuming you're getting paid or something for it, but still, like, but it's just, you stop having to redo the same stuff. You no longer have to redo the same, like, all right, add a validator, add a this, all right, now I need to search for all instances in the X page where I bind to this field and add the same thing. Like, you stop having to redo the same busy work, the same slog. And it's just, you know, it's just great. It just, you know, it makes you a better programmer, it makes you better at dealing with writing applications. It makes it better for other people to come in. Like the first time somebody else coming into a Frostilicus framework app, it'll be a little weird, but the 20th time, it's gonna be super easy. But if you took 20 XPages applications that other people wrote just randomly, it's complete, everyone's different. You relearn it from scratch. One guy loves script libraries, one guy doesn't know about them, one guy uses Lotus script for everything, just does it all with agents. It's like, but if they're all like this, you get it, and it's just consistent, it's great. And so, you know, whether you use my framework, whether you write your own, think about app structure. As a community, we need to stop having train wrecks. Just think about app structure, and it pays off. Just even the tough parts, even the complicated Java stuff, like it really, really pays off. Believe me. Are there any questions? Yes.
You mentioned earlier about visiting an app and determining how it's working. You just kind of like walk us through, like, I think I have a sense, but say if you were coming back to this application, what would you look at? Like, how would you figure out what it's doing? Okay, yeah. So how would if I came back to this app later, how would I figure out what it's doing? So say, this app is, well, it's very simple, so it'll be easy anyway. Unfortunately, the other main app that's much more complicated is not something I'm going to open source, so I can't demonstrate that one necessarily. But like, okay, say I'm coming back to this one, and so I know this is a framework app. It could be your company's framework, but it's similarly structured. So okay, what do I need to know about this app? It's called MBI demo app. It doesn't mean anything. All right, what are the objects? And so forms could, well, not in this case, but forms, maybe they can tell me something. Okay, I'll just look at the model package, and it's even better if you use Package Explorer to do it. See, okay, I have config, I have controller, I have model. So I want to see all my model objects. There's one here, there could be 50. But you'd still know these are the model objects. There's MBI item in another app. There could be, customer, project, item, not item. That was my own fault. But there could be customer, project, task, what have you. And so you just know. That's the stuff, that's where the model objects are. So step one, most of the time, step one for learning about an app is where's the stuff? What are the nouns in this application? And so coming in from outside, I'd say, those are the nouns, those are the models, that's the main stuff. Everything else is gonna deal with them in some way. Like they're gonna be the core. And I can also see, all right, this gets data from another database, and in this case, it's using a config. So that's, all right, I know this is potentially from another database, now I know where to look, rather than search for @dblookup to see if any of them use another database, see if there's any JDBC stuff going on. No, I see right here, it uses another database, and so now I know that's something I need to care about, because that's a model object. And nowhere else am I gonna have database access code, because that's the job of the model. And then once I get further into it, it's like, okay, so I have this item page. What goes on the page that edits the item? So I can see, all right, where is the UI coming from? So I look at the X page to see the UI. All right, what happens when I hit save? Well, I know that it's using method bindings to go with the controller. So I go to the controller and say, this is what happens when I hit save. So now I know anytime if there's executable code happening on that page, I know where to go. So once I get into like, okay, the client said, can we have it so that it displays a different message, or can we have it send an email? So it's like, okay, if I wanted to send an email every time an item is saved, I go to the item model and I add it there. If it's only when it's done via this form, I go to the controller and add it there. Like I already know
50% of how I'm going to solve the problem, just because I know like that's where the code's supposed to be. And so if somebody else had done it and there were a bunch of pages and a bunch of controllers, I know that's where the controllers are. So if I want to figure out how this page is doing its work, I look at the controller. And it goes further. Like in this case, I have a config bean, which it's hard coded, but you're not supposed don't hard code stuff in production. But in this case, it is. It config bean, so you could look and say, okay, it's reading from a properties file, or it's reading from a document. Okay, that's where I need to go for config, and I know that because I've got a package that says config, and that's where my config stuff is. And so, say it has servlets. Say it's sending servlets. Oh, actually, that does remind me of one last bit. Say it has servlets that other applications are using. I'd have a package called servlet, and that's where the servlets would be. And say, okay, rather than saying, oh, this X page by the name looks like an X agent maybe, and you open it up, okay, renders equals false, so okay, it's an X page. But no, it's like servlet. That's where it is. So before I actually finish now, REST APIs. So this is something that Mark Roden's going to be doing a presentation next, I think. Maybe what? 3 o'clock. Okay, so he's doing one at 3. And it's about AngularJS, which is awesome. It's definitely something that everybody should look into. And one of the things, anytime you're doing AngularJS, which if you're not familiar with it, it's a client-side JavaScript framework where you connect to REST services generally. So you do your entire UI in JavaScript instead of doing it in XPages. And so when you're doing that, it's like, well, okay, well, all of my code is in server JavaScript, or it's in Java. But this is another thing where I realized, okay, I have model objects, and I know they all act the same way. They're all data object. They get the data the same way. The collections are all the same. I can just make an API for all model objects all at once. So every time you're using the Frostillicus framework, this is all subject to change because there's some weird stuff. But this is all like once you have it and you have models, that you can go to fmodel and the name of the class, and then / whatever the name of the collection is. So in this case, catalog, and I just have this. Like there's nothing in my model objects. Like there's no code in here at all that does anything with REST. Nothing knows about JavaScript. Nothing knows about when you access it this special way. It's just done. The framework knows, oh, you have model objects? I can expose that. And so it uses all the same fields. You can post data to it, and if it doesn't validate properly, you get back an error. If you have computed stuff in there that has different getters and setters, it will use those. And so if you have something that, if you have the title field, or like say you have a task in a task database with normalized data where the client name isn't stored in the task, which admittedly you probably have to because it's Domino. But say you want to get it from the client, you have a get client name. This will find that method and then just display the client name by doing whatever is in there. So it gets from another document, it could get it from a SQL database, whatever that needs to do. This just does it.